On August 12th, in the year 30 BC, Roman soldiers forced open the doors of a mausoleum in Alexandria. Inside, Cleopatra had sealed herself away, choosing a tomb she had ordered built as her final refuge. After 22 years ruling Egypt as the last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she was now trapped within stone walls meant for the dead. Outside, Octavian waited. The man who would soon become Emperor Augustus had hunted Cleopatra across the Mediterranean. He had shattered her fleet at Actium, seized Alexandria, and driven Mark Antony to suicide. Now, at last, Egypt's queen was within his grasp. What unfolded over the next 11 days, ending with Cleopatra's death on August 12th, revealed a level of calculated cruelty that later Roman historians would carefully soften, disguise, or erase. The version most people know is elegant, almost poetic. A proud queen, choosing death by the bite of a sacred serpent rather than submitting to Roman humiliation. The reality preserved in private letters and first-hand accounts is far darker. To understand Cleopatra's fate, we have to understand what she represented to Octavian. She was not simply a defeated enemy. She was not just a political rival. Cleopatra embodied everything Rome publicly claimed to despise and secretly feared. She was female power, exercised without male oversight. She commanded immense Eastern wealth that mocked Roman ideals of restraint and austerity. And most dangerously, she possessed dynastic legitimacy that rivaled Octavian's own claims to imperial authority. Mark Antony's alliance with Cleopatra and his recognition of their children as legitimate heirs to vast eastern territories had created an intolerable precedent. Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was a living challenge to Rome's authority and to Octavian's vision of a Roman world centered entirely on himself. Killing her outright would not be enough. What she symbolized had to be dismantled, and that required something far more deliberate than a swift execution. When Roman soldiers burst into the mausoleum, Cleopatra was accompanied only by her two most loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian. According to Plutarch, who later had access to sources close to the event, Cleopatra attempted to kill herself immediately, but was stopped. This moment is often romanticized. The truth was brutal. Cleopatra was not gently restrained. She was physically overpowered. Her clothing was torn during the struggle. She was dragged from the tomb and displayed before a small group of Roman officers whom Octavian had deliberately summoned to witness her capture. This humiliation was no accident. It was the opening act of a carefully staged spectacle designed to shatter not only the woman, but the myth surrounding her. Cleopatra was taken back to her own chambers in the royal palace of Alexandria, now occupied by Octavian and his command staff. There, a series of encounters between the captive queen and her conqueror revealed the raw mechanics of power that history would later polish into something far more palatable. Octavian visited Cleopatra personally the day after her capture. At least 3 Roman officers were present, and fragments of their testimony survive in later historical writings. This was not a meeting between equals. It bore no resemblance to the dramatic negotiations portrayed in modern films. It was an interrogation. Octavian laid out the only 2 paths available to her, with deliberate clarity. The first option was total submission. Cleopatra would surrender all remaining royal treasures of Egypt. She would publicly renounce any political claims on behalf of her children, and she would agree to be taken to Rome. There, she would be displayed in Octavian's triumph, paraded through the streets in chains as a living symbol of Roman victory. In return, Octavian promised that her life would be spared and that her surviving children Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus, would not be executed. The second option was never stated directly. It did not need to be. Refusal meant immediate death, not only for Cleopatra, but for her children, the complete extinction of the Ptolemaic line, and Egypt's reduction to a Roman province. Cleopatra asked for time to consider. Confident in his absolute control, Octavian agreed. What followed over the next several days revealed both Cleopatra's strategic intelligence and the ruthless system closing in around her. She did not negotiate directly with Octavian. Instead, she worked through his subordinates, especially Cornelius Gallus, the officer assigned to guard her. She offered bribes, she made promises, she attempted to create fractures within the Roman command structure. At the same time, she made requests that appeared harmless on the surface. Permission to visit Mark Antony's tomb to perform proper rites. Access to medicines to treat injuries sustained during her capture. The constant presence of her two attendants. Each request was calculated. Cleopatra was assembling the only form of control she still possessed, influence over the conditions of her own death. But Octavian was not easily deceived. His informants reported her bribery attempts. More importantly, they noted that she had begun eating very little. Roman physicians were sent to examine her. Their reports described signs consistent with suicidal intent. It was then that Octavian deployed the most cruel psychological weapon available to him. He ordered Cleopatra's 3 surviving children brought into her presence under guard. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, had already been executed in secret days earlier, though Cleopatra had not yet been told. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt at suicide would result in the immediate death of her children. For the first time in her life, Cleopatra was completely powerless. The woman who had navigated courts and empires through intelligence and persuasion was trapped by a threat she could neither outmaneuver nor endure. Her psychological state during these days was recorded in disturbing detail by Olympus, her personal physician, whose account survives in fragments quoted by Plutarch and Cassius Dio. He described how Cleopatra maintained careful composure during official visits, only to collapse emotionally when alone with her attendants. She inflicted wounds upon her own arms, hidden beneath long sleeves. She stopped attending to her appearance, something unthinkable for a woman who had always used image as a political tool. Most disturbingly, she began experiencing hallucinations, speaking as though Mark Antony were present, holding imagined conversations with him. On August 5th, 6 days after her capture, Octavian visited Cleopatra again. This meeting was markedly different from the first. Her physical and mental deterioration was unmistakable. Her face showed signs of trauma, exhaustion, and extreme stress. Over several hours of conversation, she appeared to surrender. She agreed to full cooperation. She revealed the locations of hidden treasures. She provided detailed information about Egypt's administration that would ease Roman control. Satisfied, Octavian relaxed the guard around her. It was a fatal mistake. Cleopatra had not capitulated. She had entered the final phase of a desperate plan. What she intended remains debated, but the evidence suggests she was not simply arranging her own death. She was trying to ensure that her death would occur on her terms, and crucially, that it could not be exploited by Octavian in the triumph he so desperately desired. The Roman triumph was not merely a military celebration. It was political theater, a ritual of domination. Defeated enemies were displayed before the people of Rome as living proof of imperial power. To parade Cleopatra alive in chains would have been the ultimate symbolic conquest of the East. Cleopatra was determined to deny him that victory, but any obvious suicide attempt would doom her children. She needed a death that would appear unavoidable, or at least beyond the ability of her guards to prevent. And so she waited. In the final days before her death, Cleopatra appeared to change. On August 10th and 11th, witnesses noted a visible improvement in her behavior. She began eating again. She spoke more freely with her guards. She even discussed practical details about her upcoming journey to Rome. To the Roman officers watching her, it looked like acceptance. To Octavian, it appeared her spirit had finally been broken. But this transformation was deliberate. Cleopatra was performing one last role, drawing on the same skills she had used throughout her life. Not to preserve her power, but to manage the conditions of her end. By convincing her captors that she had accepted her fate, she created the narrow opening she needed to act without placing her children in immediate danger. On the morning of August 12th, Cleopatra made her final request. She asked Octavian for permission to visit Mark Antony's tomb one last time before departing for Rome. She framed it as a farewell, a final act of mourning before submitting fully to Roman authority. Octavian, confident that she no longer posed a threat, granted the request. What happened that afternoon inside Antony's tomb has never been fully clarified. The version that survived into popular memory speaks of a serpent hidden in a basket of figs, of a queen choosing a poetic death by the bite of an asp. It is an image that has been repeated for centuries. But this story collapses under scrutiny. First, snake venom, even from venomous species native to Egypt, rarely kills as quickly or as peacefully as the legend claims. Death is typically prolonged, painful, and unpredictable. Second, Cleopatra was known to have studied toxicology extensively. Multiple ancient sources attest to her experiments with poisons and her detailed understanding of their effects. A woman with that knowledge would not have entrusted her death to an uncontrolled animal. Most telling of all is what the Roman guards found when they entered her chambers. Cleopatra was dead. So were her two attendants, Iris and Charmian. The idea that a single snake could kill 3 adult women in a short span of time strains credibility to the point of fantasy. Modern toxicological analysis, combined with a re-examination of ancient accounts, suggests a far more plausible explanation. Cleopatra likely used a fast-acting poison, possibly a prepared mixture involving concentrated opium, hemlock, or another potent plant-based toxin. The marks on her arm, later described as snake bites, could just as easily have been pre-existing self-inflicted wounds or even injection points. Introducing poison directly into the bloodstream would explain the rapid, relatively calm deaths of all 3 women. The serpent story may not have been invented by Roman propagandists alone. It is possible Cleopatra herself encouraged it. A death associated with a sacred Egyptian symbol was more dignified, more mythic, than a straightforward poisoning. It allowed her final act to retain cultural and royal meaning. But the most disturbing aspect of Cleopatra's death is not how she died. It is what followed. When the guards discovered the bodies, Octavian was informed immediately. According to multiple sources, his reaction was one of intense rage, not grief, but fury. Cleopatra had robbed him of the political prize he desired most. Without her alive, the triumph he had planned lost its centerpiece. The symbolic conquest of the East was incomplete. Octavian ordered his best physicians to attempt to revive her. When that failed, he briefly considered displaying her embalmed body in the triumph instead. Advisors ultimately persuaded him that this would cross even Roman standards of sacrilege. Denied the spectacle he wanted, Octavian turned to retaliation. He allowed Cleopatra to be buried with royal honors beside Mark Antony, as she had requested in a final letter. But this concession was accompanied by a systematic campaign to erase her legacy. Statues of Cleopatra throughout Alexandria were torn down. Her name was chiseled from public inscriptions. Temples and monuments associated with her reign were altered or destroyed. Even more enduring than physical destruction was the campaign of narrative control. Octavian and the historians who followed his lead reshaped Cleopatra's image for generations. She was no longer remembered as a capable ruler or a skilled political strategist. Instead, she became a caricature, a foreign seductress, a manipulative woman whose beauty had corrupted noble Roman men. This version of Cleopatra served a clear purpose. It justified Rome's conquest of Egypt. It framed Octavian's victory as a moral necessity, and it reinforced deep Roman anxieties about female autonomy and Eastern power. The fate of Cleopatra's children exposes the final hypocrisy of Octavian's promises. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish from the historical record shortly after their mother's death. Historians debate whether they were quietly executed, exiled, or died of illness while in Roman custody. Their disappearance itself speaks volumes. Only Cleopatra Selene survived, and only because Octavian found political value in her. She was married to Juba II of Mauritania, a client king installed by Rome. Through this marriage, the last living heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty was transformed into an instrument of Roman foreign policy. Even mercy, when it came, was a form of control. The story that survives of Cleopatra's final days is not an objective record. It is a narrative shaped by the victors. The image of a queen dying gracefully by a sacred serpent serves multiple ideological goals. It romanticizes the death of an enemy, making her less threatening to history. It obscures the realities of captivity, psychological torment, and coercion. And it allows Rome to present itself as magnanimous, as though Cleopatra were granted the dignity of choosing her end. The less familiar accounts tell a far harsher story. During the last 11 days of her life, Cleopatra was systematically stripped of everything that had defined her existence. Her political power was gone. Her autonomy was eliminated. Her dignity was eroded through public humiliation and constant surveillance. She was subjected to emotional blackmail through threats against her children. Even her body became a site of control, watched, examined, and regulated by her captors. The fact that she managed, in the end, to reclaim a fragment of agency is often framed as a moral victory. But that interpretation ignores the context. Cleopatra's choice was not between life and death. It was between dying on her own terms or being paraded alive through Rome as a spectacle of conquest. This is not a story of triumph. It is a case study in how absolute power operates, how it transforms even death into political theater. Cleopatra's legacy was shaped as much by what came after her death as by her actions in life. For centuries, she was viewed almost entirely through Roman eyes. The exotic temptress, the dangerous woman whose allure undermined rational Roman virtue. This portrayal was never accidental. It reinforced Roman cultural superiority. It justified imperial expansion, and it warned against women who wielded power independently. Only with modern re-examination of primary sources, Egyptian records, and archaeological evidence has a more accurate picture begun to emerge. Cleopatra was a competent administrator, a sophisticated political strategist, and a scholar fluent in multiple languages. She ruled within a deeply patriarchal world, using every available tool to preserve her kingdom and her dynasty. The location of Cleopatra's tomb remains unknown. Octavian recorded that she was buried beside Mark Antony somewhere near Alexandria, but no definitive site has ever been found. Some scholars believe Octavian deliberately obscured the location to prevent the tomb from becoming a focal point for resistance or pilgrimage. Others suggest earthquakes, floods, and centuries of construction erased all traces. There is also a darker possibility raised by some historians, that Cleopatra was never granted the honorable burial Octavian claimed, and that her body was disposed of in a far more ignominious manner as a final act of punishment. More than 2,000 years later, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognizable figures in history. Yet what most people know about her is the product of myth layered upon propaganda. Her final days were not poetic. They were marked by fear, humiliation, and the slow realization that no escape was possible. Her death, often portrayed as an elegant act of defiance, was in reality an act of desperation. The last form of control available to a woman who had spent her life navigating systems of power, only to find herself completely at the mercy of an enemy who showed none. The final image of Cleopatra that survives in popular memory is powerful, but deeply misleading. For centuries, her story has been filtered through layers of Roman propaganda, theatrical retellings, and romantic fantasy. The result is a queen frozen in myth, detached from the brutal reality of her last days. What is often forgotten is that Cleopatra did not lose her kingdom because she was reckless or naive. She lost because she stood at the intersection of forces far larger than any individual ruler could withstand. Rome was no longer a republic balancing competing interests. It was becoming an empire. And empires do not tolerate rivals, especially those who rule independently, command immense wealth, and possess legitimate dynastic authority. Cleopatra represented a different model of power. She ruled not as a Roman client, but as a sovereign monarch in her own right. She governed a complex economy, oversaw vast agricultural systems, and understood diplomacy at a level few of her contemporaries could match. She spoke multiple languages and could address foreign delegations without translators. These were not the traits of a reckless seductress. They were the tools of a capable ruler navigating an increasingly hostile world. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not acts of romantic impulse, as Roman writers would later insist. They were calculated political strategies designed to preserve Egypt's autonomy in the face of Roman expansion. When those strategies failed, the punishment was absolute. The final 11 days of Cleopatra's life stripped away every illusion of honorable conquest. There was no dignified surrender, no respectful treatment of a defeated queen. Instead, there was surveillance, coercion, and psychological pressure applied with methodical precision. Her captivity was not simply imprisonment. It was a sustained effort to break her will and convert her body into a symbol of Roman domination. The triumph Octavian envisioned was not just a celebration of victory, it was a warning. Displaying Cleopatra alive in chains would have sent a message to every ruler, every province, and every ambitious woman within Rome's expanding reach. This is what happens to those who challenge imperial authority. Cleopatra understood that message perfectly, and she refused to become it. Her decision to die was not driven by vanity or theatrical impulse. It was a final strategic calculation made under impossible constraints. By removing herself from Octavian's control, she denied him the symbolic victory he sought. In death, she accomplished what she could no longer achieve in life. She limited the narrative power of her conqueror. Even so, Octavian's response reveals how deeply her defiance cut. His fury at her death was not performative. It was practical. Without Cleopatra alive, his triumph was incomplete. The East could be conquered militarily, but its queen had escaped his grasp. That loss had to be compensated for in another way. So Octavian reshaped the story. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale. Her intelligence was reduced to cunning. Her political skill reframed as manipulation. Her sovereignty dismissed as decadence. The narrative was simple and effective. Rome had not crushed a capable ruler. It had rescued the world from a dangerous woman. This version of events proved remarkably durable. Roman historians repeated it. Medieval writers embellished it. Renaissance artists eroticized it. Modern films dramatized it. Each retelling pushed Cleopatra further from the historical woman and deeper into symbolic abstraction. Meanwhile, the tangible evidence of her rule was systematically erased. Monuments destroyed, inscriptions removed, administrative reforms forgotten. What survived did so largely through hostile sources written by men invested in justifying her defeat. The fate of her children underscores how total that defeat was. The disappearance of Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus is not an accident of history. It reflects deliberate silencing. Whether they were executed, exiled, or allowed to fade into obscurity, their removal ensured that no alternative lineage could challenge Roman authority in Egypt. Cleopatra Selene's survival, often presented as mercy, was conditional and calculated. Raised in Rome and married into a client kingdom, she was both spared and neutralized. Her lineage was absorbed, controlled, and rendered politically harmless. In this sense, Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. It continued through the manipulation of memory itself. The mystery surrounding her tomb is part of that process. A known burial site could have become a place of resistance, remembrance, or reverence. By obscuring its location, Octavian ensured that Cleopatra would have no physical center of legacy, no focal point for an alternative narrative to form. Or perhaps the truth is darker. Perhaps the honors Octavian claimed to grant her were another fiction. Another carefully crafted line in a longer campaign of image control. Without physical evidence, uncertainty itself becomes part of the punishment. More than 2,000 years later, what remains is a fragmented record and a powerful myth. But within those fragments, a clearer picture emerges. Cleopatra was not destroyed because she was weak. She was destroyed because she was dangerous to an emerging empire. Her final days expose the human cost of imperial ambition. They show how conquest operates not only on battlefields, but in private chambers. Through whispered threats rather than drawn swords. Through humiliation rather than execution. They reveal how power seeks not just obedience, but submission. Not just victory, but spectacle. Cleopatra's death is often framed as an ending. In reality, it marked a transition. With her gone, Egypt ceased to be a kingdom and became a province. Its wealth flowed directly into Roman hands. Its political traditions were dismantled. The Mediterranean world entered a new phase, dominated by a single authority. And yet, despite everything done to erase her, Cleopatra endures. She endures not because of the myths, but because of the questions she forces us to confront. Questions about power, about gender, about who gets to write history and who is written out of it. Her story challenges narratives imposed by victors and reminds us that historical truth is often buried beneath layers of intention. Cleopatra's final act was not beautiful. It was not serene. It was born of terror, grief, and a clear understanding of what awaited her if she lived. That reality does not diminish her legacy. It sharpens it. To see Cleopatra clearly is to confront the uncomfortable truth that intelligence and competence do not guarantee survival within systems built on domination. It is to recognize how easily agency can be stripped away, how even the most powerful individuals can be reduced to symbols against their will. The romantic image of Cleopatra dying gracefully by a serpent's bite is easier to accept than the truth. The truth forces us to confront cruelty without ornament, power without restraint. A woman who fought to the very end with the only means left to her. Cleopatra was not defeated in a single moment. She was dismantled piece by piece until death became the last remaining assertion of self. And that is why her story still matters. Not as legend, not as fantasy, but as a warning.